My name is David Sterling. I am 38 years old. At our family's Thanksgiving dinner at the Lake Tahoe cabin in Nevada, 28 of my relatives were gathered around the long table, watching the turkey get cold on their plates. My older brother, Michael, the golden boy, the family pride who could absolutely do no wrong, stood up, remote control in hand, and turned on the projector. He flashed that easy. Charismatic smile of his, and announced that it was finally time for everyone to see what a selfish, cold-blooded bastard I was, and what I had done to our dying father. My mother let out a heavy sigh of relief. My Uncle Robert froze, his half-raised wine glass suspended in mid-air. For 5 long years, this entire family had been entirely convinced that I was a monster. They believed that while my father was lying in the ICU after his stroke, I used my professional expertise to manipulate him, forged his power of attorney, and sold off and pocketed $320,000 of his assets while he was fighting for his life. They had completely erased me from the family. They called me a thief, a traitor, a heartless son who abandoned his own father. What they did not know was that I am a forensic fraud investigator for a top-tier accounting firm. I had saved every single encrypted network log, every wire transfer receipt, every piece of bulletproof, undeniable evidence. And what they knew even less was that the old man they thought I had utterly ruined was currently on his way to push open those heavy oak doors and completely flip this hypocritical dinner table upside down. Before I go any further, if this story is already making your heart race or your blood boil, just remember that in this world, the truth is usually the quietest thing in the room. Let me take you back to that evening. The cabin's dining room was set up with the sterile precision of a surgical theater. Michael stood at the head of the 14-foot dining table, occupying our father's traditional seat, which had been empty for 5 years. Behind him, the evening blizzard of the Sierra Nevada mountains beat against the windows, and the glow of the fireplace framed him like a hotshot prosecutor making his closing arguments to a jury. 28 people. I had counted them when I arrived an hour early, filing every face and every family connection away in my mind. Every single person in this room had chosen to believe his lies over my silence. My mother, Eleanor, sat at the opposite end of the long table. She was 68 years old, draped in the cashmere shawl my father bought her for their 35-year wedding anniversary. Out of sheer habit, she still left a spot for him. A dinner plate, silverware, a full glass of ice water, everything waiting. But everyone pretended not to notice. It was much easier for them to maintain the polite fiction that he was just feeling under the weather and couldn't handle the long trip, rather than face the brutal truth of why he refused to show up. I was banished to 3 folding tables in the corner of the living room, the designated kids' table set up for the overflow guests. My teenage nieces and nephews were staring down at their phones, and my cousin's new boyfriend, who knew nothing about the family drama, was awkwardly buttering his bread. Of course, Michael had planned this deliberately. The second I walked in and saw the place cards written in my mother's beautiful calligraphy, I knew exactly what was happening. This was not just a Thanksgiving dinner. It was a staged trial. Uncle Robert sat on the left middle side of the main table, right next to my father's empty chair. He was 72, a former compliance executive for the SEC who had been retired for 4 years, and he still sat with the rigid posture of a man who had spent half his life dissecting financial fraudsters. He kept checking his phone, looking at the front door, and glancing back at that empty chair. The moment I sat down, I noticed it. Uncle Robert suspected something. Michael's wife Chloe sat right next to him, holding a glass of champagne, a Cartier diamond bracelet gleaming on her wrist. I first noticed that specific style the year before I stopped attending family gatherings. It retailed for $24,000 and was purchased in November of 2020. I remembered it so clearly because tracking financial details comes as naturally to me as remembering birthdays. It is an occupational hazard. Yet, according to the sob story posts Michael was sharing on social media back then, begging everyone to help pull through tough times, his tech startup and crypto investments were supposed to be on the verge of bankruptcy that exact year. Right at my feet sat a Pelican waterproof dry box in a military-grade matte black. It was a gift from my father when I was promoted to senior partner at my firm. There was no card, but I recognized his shaky handwriting on the shipping label. I had carried that case all the way from my Boston apartment, flew across the country to the West Coast, and drove up the mountain with the steady pace of a man walking into a federal hearing. Because this was a hearing, and I was the only one who showed up fully prepared. 20 minutes earlier, my phone had buzzed. It was an unfamiliar Arizona number. The text message was brief. "Almost there. Don't let him show his hand too early. Love you, Dad." I read that text 3 times before my hand stopped shaking. Michael kept clicking the remote in his hand, and the projector screen behind him stayed fixed on the first slide, which read in bold letters, "Sterling Family Trust Anomaly Report." It looked highly professional, very official, and for a room full of relatives who couldn't tell the difference between a legal business liquidation and a carefully disguised money laundering operation, it was more than enough to completely convince them. The turkey was getting cold, the cranberry sauce was beginning to congeal, and the expensive china and ivy were perfectly arranged on the sideboard. Everything was perfectly set for a holiday that was about to go completely off the rails. I didn't stand up, and I didn't say a word. I just waited. Over the past 5 years, I had learned a golden rule. In a courtroom, the first person to jump up and defend themselves is usually the one who loses, and I had already lost enough. I wasn't always the villain in this family. Before I went to business school, back when I chose to leave the West Coast and head east to make something of myself, I actually believed I could have a successful career and still keep my family's affection. But I learned when I was 17 that in our household, you could only choose one. Michael was 5 years older than me, born in 1983. As the firstborn, he was our parents' guinea pig for parenting, and he turned out to be their absolute blueprint for perfection. By the time I came along in 1988, they had already decided what was right. Success was nice to look at, but staying close by was what truly mattered, and Michael was the gold standard for the perfect son. He was the high school quarterback, the homecoming king, bought a massive house in Scottsdale, Arizona by 26, had a wedding that cost more than my entire 4 years of college tuition, and had 2 beautiful kids before he turned 35. He lived just a few hours' drive from our parents in California, but the family narrative always painted him as the devoted family man who stayed close. I lived in Boston, worked 70 hours a week, and even though I flew back every other weekend to see them and FaceTimed 3 times a week, Michael controlled the narrative, and that physical distance was twisted into ironclad proof of my disloyalty. The pattern was set very early on. Every single one of Michael's business failures became a family emergency, while every one of my promotions was dismissed as just David being David. He doesn't need us anyway. In 2015, Michael's first digital currency project crashed hard. He was highly leveraged, facing a severe margin call, and desperately needed $50,000. Our parents didn't hesitate for a second to dip into their retirement funds to bail him out. I was studying for my certified fraud examiner license at the time, and only found out about it by accident months later. When I offered to repay our parents to make them whole, my mother just told me that it was already taken care of, that I should stay out of family business, and that I should just go back to focusing on my spreadsheets. Much later, in 2024, after I hired a private cyber intelligence investigator, I discovered that the $50,000 was never actually paid back. Our parents' credit card debt had quietly ballooned from $40,000 to $90,000, and they had just silently swallowed the loss. What Michael swallowed was a completely different lesson. As long as he spun a good story, our parents would always choose to believe him over cold, hard facts. The family photo wall in my mother's hallway was much more honest than any of us. There were 25 photos of Michael's life: his sports cars, his kids, their vacations in Hawaii, candid shots of him laughing with our mother by the pool. For me, there were only 3 lonely photos. My high school graduation, a stiff picture of me holding my Boston University acceptance letter, and a shot from the day I got my license, where my dad had his arm around my shoulder, and I had this lost expression on my face, like someone who had won a race but had no idea if anyone actually cared. After 2017, I stopped expecting any new photos of myself to go up on that wall. By the time my father fell ill in 2021, first with early-stage Parkinson's, and then with a sudden stroke in November of that year, the family stage had already been set perfectly. Michael was the devoted son holding vigil at the bedside, and I was the cold-blooded elite whose head was so full of audits and compliance that he couldn't comprehend family pressure. My father was 71 that year. The doctors said he could recover, but his nervous system didn't care about their timeline. In that first year alone, he was hospitalized 3 times. Michael moved him to a high-end care facility in Scottsdale, using the excuse that the climate would be better for his recovery and that it would make it easier for our mother to visit. I still flew in every 2 weeks and called 3 times a week, but Michael's version of the story was that he was the only one there day in and day out, simply because he was the one filtering everything the rest of the family heard. When you are exceptionally good at what you do professionally, there is a strange side effect. People start viewing your precision as coldness. I had built a reputation at my firm in Boston specializing in corporate fraud, asset concealment, and elder financial exploitation. I helped clients recover stolen funds and protected vulnerable people from being bled dry. I was incredibly good at it. I was meticulous, detail-oriented, and purely rational. But Michael turned that into a weapon against me. David only cares about procedures and the law. He would constantly sneer to our relatives. He doesn't know how to be a son. He's just an auditing machine. He twisted my professional ethics into emotional detachment. He took my rational, level-headed advice about protecting Dad's wealth and framed it as completely heartless. And since the family was already so used to Michael's dramatic performances, they swallowed his story hook, line, and sinker. I didn't push back right away. If years of fraud investigation training have taught me anything, it is that jumping to defend yourself too early just makes you look guilty. So, I stayed quiet. I kept visiting Dad as much as possible, helped Mom organize her messy medical insurance paperwork, and watched my brother slowly rewrite my entire history with our father right in front of my eyes. The irony of it all is that my literal specialty is investigating financial elder abuse. I had spent 4 years putting caregivers, relatives, and shady advisors into federal prison for stealing homes and life savings from vulnerable older folks. Back in 2022, I had just won a $3.5 million fraud case, successfully convicting a nephew who had systematically drained his 80-year-old uncle's trust fund. I just never imagined that one day I would have to use those exact same investigative tactics against my own brother. But then came November of 2021. On November 10th, Dad was rushed to the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix after a severe ischemic stroke. Half of his body was paralyzed and he could barely swallow. They put him on respiratory support and told us the situation was incredibly serious, but there was still hope if we stayed aggressive with neurological rehab. I flew out immediately from an audit site in Boston, still wearing my work suit. Michael was already there, playing the role of the frantic, perfect family man right at the nurse's station. Mom looked absolutely exhausted and terrified, curled up in a chair as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. Chloe was sitting on a bench in the hallway, glued to her laptop and running her supposedly high-end boutique personal shopping business. Dad was conscious. He was exhausted and scared, but there was still a sharpness in his eyes. When he saw me walk into the room, he gave me a look that told me he had been fighting to stay alert just to tell me what needed to be done. David, his voice was heavily slurred from the facial paralysis, but he was completely coherent. You know how to handle money stuff. If my brain ever stops working entirely, I need someone who won't lose their head. I want you to have my full power of attorney. When Dad said my name, Michael's face didn't show shock. It just showed pure, cold calculation. On November 12th, a hospital social worker brought over the standard power of attorney forms. Dad stuck to his guns and explained his reasoning to Mom. He told her that David knows how books are kept, and that I would ask the toughest questions. He knew I wouldn't let anyone take advantage of the family. I wanted to help. Of course I wanted to help him. But I also knew how incredibly messy this was from a professional compliance standpoint. Dad, I appreciate your trust more than you know, I said, sitting by his bedside and carefully avoiding the IV lines. But I am a licensed forensic accountant. I audit corporate financial fraud for a living. If I take direct control of your personal assets as your agent, and those assets involve family commercial real estate and stocks, it looks like a massive conflict of interest to my firm's compliance board. I really think you should look into a neutral third-party trust company, or at least let me introduce you to a professional fiduciary. That was at 2:30 in the afternoon. I have the phone logs to prove that immediately afterward, I called Alan Campbell, the head of compliance at my firm, to get an official ethics consultation. He confirmed exactly what I already knew. It wasn't technically illegal, but it was a massive professional risk, and it would be best to decline. Out in the hallway, Michael was pacing back and forth, furiously talking on his phone. I caught snippets of the conversation. He was saying that if I got control of those properties, his entire cash flow would collapse. On November 14th, I drafted a formal declination of fiduciary appointment. I had it notarized at the hospital's Patient Services Center by a notary named Marcus Reed, stamp number AZ-883291, at 10:45 in the morning. I gave Dad a copy, filed one with my firm's compliance department, and mailed another copy to my parents' house in California. The letter spelled everything out in plain English. It stated that based on professional ethical standards governing fiduciary relationships, I was respectfully declining to act as Arthur Sterling's financial agent, and that to avoid any appearance of impropriety, this decision was made entirely to protect the safety of his assets. Dad understood. He patted my arm with his one good hand and told me that I was always the honest one. 2 weeks later, I was the absolute villain of the family. What I didn't know back then, and what I wouldn't uncover until 2024 after paying $15,000 to a cybersecurity and asset recovery expert named Victor Lance, was that just 3 days after I submitted my declination, Michael got his hands on a blank durable power of attorney form. He forged a new version dated November 17th and stamped it using Dad's signature seal, which he had stolen from our parents' house. Dad had kept a signature stamp for years because he used to sign delivery invoices constantly back when he ran his brick-and-mortar business. Later on, when his hands started shaking badly, he would occasionally use it to sign insurance documents. Mom kept it in the second drawer on the left side of the mahogany desk in the study. Michael knew exactly where it was. On November 20th, Michael submitted that forged power of attorney to Arizona First National Bank. The document listed him as the primary agent, but buried deep in the fine print, the sections that bank tellers almost never read closely, he had added my name as a joint authorized viewer. It was a brilliant, malicious move. It allowed him to drain the accounts while leaving a digital paper trail that pointed straight at me. The cash grab started immediately. On November 21st, $75,000 was wired out. The bank's internal network logs showed the transfer originated from an IP address tied to Michael's home internet, but the memo line read, "Per instructions of D. Sterling." On November 26th, Dad's 1967 Ford Shelby GT 500 was sold off at a fire sale price, bringing in $95,000. On December 3rd, a small commercial warehouse on the outskirts of Phoenix was leveraged for $150,000 in cash. In just 20 days, a grand total of $320,000 was gone. The hard assets my father had spent his entire life building were wiped clean in less than a month. Every single liquidation and transfer happened in Arizona, 2,500 miles away from my office in Boston. I found all these details on page 42 of Victor's investigative report, complete with screenshots of the surveillance footage from the auction house. December 3rd at 3:10 in the afternoon. A 6-foot-tall man in a tailored suit matching Michael's build was shaking hands with the buyer while holding the paperwork. His gray Tesla was parked right there in the background, license plate AZ-CYBER9. I watched that silent security footage dozens of times. Michael was laughing and chatting with the buyer, signing away the last of our dad's life savings as casually as if he were ordering a coffee at Starbucks. Meanwhile, I was completely in the dark, busy tracking down tens of millions of dollars in hidden offshore accounts for corporate clients in Boston, totally oblivious to the trap being built around me. The first blocked call happened on December 5th. Ever since Dad had been moved from the ICU to a long-term rehab facility on November 28th, I had been calling his old cell phone every single day. He had used that number for 7 years, and the contact photo on my phone was a picture of the two of us watching the rowing races on the Charles River. For the first week, our calls were completely normal. We talked about his physical therapy, his progress with swallowing, and how he was complaining that the hospital food had absolutely no flavor. But on December 5th at 8:15 in the evening, I called, and it went straight to voicemail. I tried calling Mom's phone instead. Michael picked up. He told me Dad didn't want to talk to me and told me to stop calling. I felt the floor completely drop out from under me. I asked him what he meant, what was wrong, and what had happened. He told me that I knew exactly what I did and told me to stop playing innocent. I told him I had no idea what kind of crazy game he was playing and demanded he put Dad on the phone. Michael told me Dad was asleep and that Dad had explicitly said if I ever called again, to tell me I was dead to him. He told me Dad found out about the money and knew everything. The call lasted exactly 58 seconds. I recorded it. As an investigator, I keep a record of everything. The very next day, I received an email from my dad's account, arthur.sterling.1950@outlook.com, an address he had set up a few years back just to learn how to read the news on a tablet. The subject line read, Dad, what is going on? Because I had sent 4 frantic emails the night before. The text of the email was as cold as a scalpel. It said that he had trusted me with his financial future, and that I had taken advantage of his illness to rob him. It said he had seen the bank transfers and the auction receipts, showing I took $320,000, that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with me anymore, and asked me to respect his wishes. That email was sent on December 6th at 10 in the evening. It wasn't until 2024, when Victor performed a deep packet data capture and traced the IP address, that I proved definitively that the email had been sent from Michael's gigabit home network in Scottsdale, not from Dad's rehab center. Michael had logged into Dad's account and typed it out himself. Dad never even saw my desperate messages, and he certainly never wrote that response. I sent a 1,000-word email explaining everything, attaching the notarized declination form, begging him to look at the dates. The email bounced back. The account had been deleted. On December 10th, I flew to California to our childhood home. The California winter was bright and sunny, but the driveway I grew up on felt completely freezing. Mom opened the front door, but she stood firmly in the doorway, blocking the entrance with her body. Your father is resting in Arizona. He doesn't want to see you. Michael explained everything to us. Mom, I didn't take a single dime from this family. I have proof. I explicitly declined the power of attorney. I can show you the documents right now. David, Michael showed me the screenshots of the online transactions. Every single transfer authorization had your initials on it. Why are you still lying to me? Because someone forged my signature and my authorization. Mom, logically, this makes absolutely no sense. The only thing that makes no sense is you stealing your sick father's life savings and then trying to throw dirt on your brother. Eleanor stood at the door, her hands tightly gripping the doorframe. Through the hallway behind her, I could see Michael's coat hanging on the rack. Michael was right inside the house, and he was listening to every word. As I turned around to leave, I glanced up. Behind the second-floor guest room window, Michael was watching me. He wasn't angry at all. His face was full of the smug, arrogant satisfaction of a winner. Christmas came 2 weeks later. For the first time in 38 years, I wasn't invited, but I still drove a rental car and parked half a block away from Michael's mansion in Scottsdale. I just couldn't help myself. At 5 in the afternoon, I watched them through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Michael was sitting at the head of the long dining table. Chloe, my mother, Uncle Robert, my cousins, the whole family was there. The empty chair that should have been mine didn't even exist. The table was perfectly set to fit only the invited guests. I wasn't even a missing puzzle piece. I had been completely erased. That morning, I spent 4 hours making a pot of New England clam chowder, a dish I learned to make in Boston and my dad's absolute favorite. I put it in a thermos, left it on the porch, rang the doorbell, and drove away. Later, a cousin who still occasionally likes my posts on LinkedIn told me that Michael poured the entire pot straight down the sink. He told everyone that they didn't eat food sent by a thief. That day, Uncle Robert had walked out into the yard. As I pulled my car away, our eyes met in the rearview mirror. He didn't wave. He didn't try to stop me. He just turned around and walked back inside the house. Over the next few months, Michael built his perfect, airtight narrative. He told the entire family that I had used my expert legal and tax knowledge to force Dad into signing the paperwork while he was confused in the ICU. Because I was the expert in these matters, I made it look absolutely flawless. Then, while he was at his weakest, I heartlessly cleaned out his assets. Michael claimed that when Dad discovered what happened, I vanished. He said I cut off all contact and refused to take our father's calls. He showed the relatives carefully selected bank screenshots, pointing to the pages with the forged signatures. He even had Chloe testify, claiming she personally heard me putting pressure on Dad at the hospital. The narrative was just too perfect. With no way to contact my father and no one willing to hear my side of the story, I fell into a state of total silence. By early 2022, the family had chosen the truth they wanted to believe. I learned the brutal reality that every investigator knows. When your opponent controls all the witnesses, all the evidence, and the judge, you cannot win the case. Michael turned the family into his own private courtroom, and I was convicted without ever getting a chance to present my case. In February of 2022, I stopped fighting back. Screaming and fighting would only make me look like a desperate criminal. Instead, I did what auditors do best. I started building a file. In March of 2022, I set up a digital Dropbox hidden on an encrypted cloud server. I found a secure network protocol platform used mostly by medical emergency personnel and sent my dad my first encrypted voice message. At first, it was once a week, then it became once a month. I kept the messages short and emotional. There were no accusations and no legal defense. I just told him that I loved him, I missed him, and I hoped he was feeling better. Dad, I don't know if you can hear this, but I just want you to know I'm thinking about you. It's snowing in Boston, so please make sure the nurses give you an extra blanket. I love you, Dad. It's David. When digital messages didn't seem to work, I started shipping physical FedEx packages. To make sure there was a legal delivery record, I always chose the highest service tier that required a direct signature from the recipient. On June 14, 2023, it was my dad's 73rd birthday. Happy birthday, Dad. I'm sitting in my office looking at our photo by the Charles River. I am so proud to be your son. If you ever want to reach me, my secure backup number is 617-555-0198. I love you. Over 5 years, I sent 112 packages and 85 voice messages. Every single one was meticulously logged in my master Excel spreadsheet, tracking delivery dates, tracking numbers, and network routing data. 90 of the physical packages showed successful delivery receipts. Every single one was signed for by either Chloe Sterling or M. Sterling. Michael intercepted every single package. He kept them from my father and created the false impression that I was completely ignoring him. I never got a reply, not even once. I started forcing myself to check the Arizona obituary websites every single week, terrified that he might pass away without anyone ever notifying me. My career became my only sanctuary. In 2024, at 36, I was fast-tracked and promoted to senior partner and regional head of investigations at my accounting firm. That is an incredibly young age for this industry. I became well known for my cold forensic analysis and bulletproof evidence chains when tracking offshore accounts and exposing complex Ponzi schemes. I won massive civil judgments and testified multiple times as an expert witness in court. In the fall of 2024, I helped a 79-year-old man successfully recover his retirement fund, which his own son had secretly moved to the Cayman Islands. After the judge read the verdict, the old man looked at me and said that I fought that case like a man who knows exactly how much it hurts to lose everything. That afternoon, I locked myself in my car in a subterranean parking garage in Boston and just cried for 30 minutes straight. I could only piece together information about my family like scraps of shredded paper. I wrote a basic web scraper that bypassed Michael's social media blocks so I could regularly pull his public updates. Thanksgiving of 2023 featured a post that read, "Precious time with Dad, family is everything, firstborn responsibilities, and blessed." The photo showed Michael, Chloe, my mother, and my dad sitting in a wheelchair. Dad was incredibly thin, his eyes looked hollow, and he was placed right at the edge of the frame, never looking directly at the camera. But he was alive. That was the first confirmation of life I had received in 2.5 years. I captured every single photo and ran a timeline comparison. Using compliant public databases, I looked up Michael's asset registrations. At the end of 2022, he bought a vacation condo in Las Vegas for $450,000 in cash. Meanwhile, his Delaware-registered tech company entity, which was on the verge of being shut down in late 2021, suddenly received a $300,000 cash injection in January of 2022 to survive the crisis. If you know how to read a balance sheet, the pattern is right there, clear as day. In August of 2024, I made the decision that changed everything. I formally hired Victor Lance, a veteran former special agent from the FBI's white-collar crime unit. He had 25 years of experience tracking cyber fraud. He charged $400 an hour plus a $20,000 upfront retainer. "You are a professional," he told me during our first meeting at a quiet coffee shop in Boston's Copley Square, looking over the thick binder of preliminary briefs I pushed across the table. "You know that if he hasn't been medically declared incompetent, even if the money is gone, local law enforcement might not even open a criminal case." "I don't need a criminal case right now," I said, taking a sip of my black coffee. "I need facts. I need timestamps, IP addresses, unalterable ironclad facts. Because one day, I am going to get an opportunity to lay this all out in front of him. Until then, my arsenal needs to be completely full." Victor delivered his final investigative report in January of 2025, and it was a 140-page bombshell. It included a high-definition forensic analysis of the forged power of attorney. It showed the blockchain hash paths of the money moving from Arizona to the Cayman Islands and back into Michael's personal business accounts. The network nodes for those emails telling me to stay away proved they all originated from Michael's home Wi-Fi. It even documented the carrier logs of my blocked phone number. The most devastating part was on page 74, under the subject line, "Physical Isolation and Digital Hijacking of Communications of Arthur Sterling by Michael Sterling." The report showed that in December of 2021, Michael purchased network firewall hardware. He completely blacklisted my MAC address at the router's administrator level. He confiscated my dad's original tablet, lied to him by saying it was broken, and replaced it with a restricted device that could only contact whitelisted numbers. Every single FedEx package I sent was intercepted and destroyed right at the residential property office. In February of 2025, I hired an independent outside forensic auditor to cross-verify the findings. The conclusion on page 22 of the audit report was clear. There was absolutely no evidence that David Sterling ever withdrew or touched any of the funds in question. All asset liquidations and transfers were completed on-site in the state of Arizona by an individual matching the biological characteristics and password credentials of Michael Sterling. I was holding a nuke in my hands. I had a 140-page report from a former FBI agent, a bulletproof independent audit, 90 FedEx delivery receipts, server logs tracking 85 cloud-stored voice messages, and a notarized declination of trustee status. I had absolutely everything. The only thing I lacked was the chance to drop this bomb right in front of him. Before I knew it, autumn of 2025 arrived. I was still leaving messages in a system that felt like a black hole. Hope was wearing thin, but it had turned into a daily ritual, like a monk doing penance. If I stopped, it meant admitting Michael won. Then, on November 10th, my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Arizona number. I picked up, but all I heard was static and rustling. In the background, I could faintly hear the steady beeps of medical equipment, and then the line went dead. I called back, but it went straight to voicemail. I had no idea it was my dad. He had managed to grab a phone during physical therapy when the nurse wasn't looking, desperately dialing my number from memory, but he got the last digit wrong. What I didn't know then was that the first domino had just fallen. The waterproof case sitting under my feet at the Thanksgiving dinner table was packed at 4 o'clock that morning. Every single document was sealed in a clear sleeve, color-coded, and organized in perfect logical order. I wasn't doing this out of some faint hope. I was doing this to wage a war of total annihilation. Red Tab 1, the original notarized declination of authority, dated November 14, 2021. Blue Tab 2, Victor Lance's 140-page cyber and asset tracing report. Green Tab 3, the independent auditor's cash flow analysis. Yellow Tab 4, 90 FedEx delivery confirmation receipts. Orange Tab 5, the cloud server access logs and full transcripts for all 85 voice messages. Purple Tab 6, surveillance footage screenshots and signature analysis reports of Michael, all obtained legally. Black Tab 7, a comparative timeline chart, perfectly matching the exact dates money was cashed out to the dates Michael purchased his Las Vegas property and injected capital into his company. Inside the case was also a tiny military-grade audio recorder with high-fidelity sound capture. I knew Michael was going to give a speech, and I needed to record every single lie out of his mouth to use as evidence in court. Michael had no clue that besides all this, I had prepared something even more devastating. 6 sworn, notarized affidavits. 1 from Marcus, the notary, 1 from my head of compliance, 1 from Victor, the former FBI agent, 1 from the independent auditor, and 2 from the assistants who helped me manage the mail back then. On top of that, buried at the very bottom of the waterproof case, was a completed signed whistleblower complaint ready to be filed with the FBI White-Collar Crime Division and the SEC for wire fraud and money laundering. Michael had used forged legal documents to move funds across state lines and laundered them through multiple shell entities, which is a straight-up federal felony. I was giving him one last chance to come clean. If he didn't take it, I was going to hit the nuclear button. I had spent 5 years building this case like it was a multinational fraud investigation, because in a way it was. Michael hadn't just stolen money, he stole my father, my family, and my dignity as a son. The text from Dad saying "almost there" came in 20 minutes before dinner. 3 weeks earlier, in early November, a home physical therapist named Sarah changed everything. Sarah was in charge of Dad's daily physical rehab in Scottsdale. After years of therapy, Dad's neurological recovery was actually quite advanced. Aside from needing a wheelchair, his mind was sharp as a tack. Sarah's job didn't involve house cleaning, but on November 2nd, a part on Dad's wheelchair broke, so she went out to the shelves in Michael's garage to look for a spare. Tucked away behind stacks of boxes, she found an old dust-covered Apple iPad. It had a handwritten label from Michael that read, "Dead e-waste, late 2021. Sarah noticed the charging port was completely intact. Out of curiosity, and thinking it might hold some old family photos for the old man, she plugged it in. The iPad booted up. It picked up a faint Wi-Fi signal, and then years of cloud data started syncing like crazy. The screen lit up with an avalanche of notifications, all from the exact same number: 112 unread emails and scans, and 85 encrypted voicemail alerts, all sent by David Sterling. The dates spanned 5 whole years. Sarah had seen my name on the care registry before. Michael had explicitly written a note next to it. Second son David, do not contact. Extremely dangerous. History of financial elder abuse. But a guy who commits financial abuse and runs off with the cash doesn't spend 5 years calling like a ghost, nearly 200 times, into a total void. Sarah hid the iPad in her therapy bag and smuggled it into Dad's room. That afternoon, while Michael and Chloe were out at a cocktail party, she put the earbuds in Dad's ears. "Mr. Arthur, I found this in the garage. I think you need to hear it for yourself." Dad was confused at first. Messages from David? But Michael said he changed his number and completely vanished. "Sir, there are 85 voicemails here. I don't know what went down with your family, but this is definitely not someone who completely vanished." Dad listened for 4 straight hours. Sarah watched the old man, who had been broken down by illness and lies, as his face went from blank confusion to sheer shock, then to heartbreaking grief, and finally to a deep, bottomless rage. He listened to every single message. Some of them he replayed 3 times. When he took the earbuds out, the weakness was completely gone from his eyes. "I need to go to Lake Tahoe," he said, staring out the window, his voice sounding as rough as rusty iron. "Their whole family is going to the cabin there for Thanksgiving. Can you help me?" Over the next 3 weeks, they secretly planned everything. Dad couldn't fight Michael alone. Michael controlled his medical accounts, his freedom of movement, and his contact with the outside world. But Thanksgiving was the perfect opportunity. Mom would go up early to set up, and Michael had to maintain his fake persona as the devoted eldest son. And I, as Uncle Robert had casually confirmed over a fishing phone call, would be there too. On November 19th at 9 p.m., my backup secure phone rang. Unknown number. "David, it's Dad, don't hang up." I lost my words. It had been 5 years. The voice was older than I remembered, with a slight wheeze, but it was absolutely him. "I listened to your messages, all of them, and I saw the records of those rejected packages. Sarah is driving me up in her RV tomorrow. I'll be there before dinner. If Michael wants to put on a show, let him. Do not show your hand until I walk through that door. Can you promise me that?" "Dad?" My throat tightened, and that was the only word I could choke out. "I'm sorry, son. I am so incredibly sorry. I'll make everything clear tomorrow. I love you." The call lasted 15 minutes. I recorded it. Force of habit. But during those 15 minutes he said, "I love you" 12 times. It was as if he was trying to use a single phone call to make up for 5 years of stolen time. In the early morning hours of November 20th, Sarah drove Arthur Sterling out of Arizona in a specially modified RV equipped with a wheelchair lift. They headed through the desert, driving straight for the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a 12-hour drive. To protect this old man, Sarah had taken a long leave of absence and risked violating her non-disclosure agreement. At 4:30 p.m., the RV pulled into a pine forest half a mile away from the Lake Tahoe cabin. "Just tell me whenever you're ready," she told him. A therapist who was a total stranger had chosen to stand on the side of the truth, ready to give my father back to me. Back at the dinner table, Michael's slideshow was pure choreographed theater. He had calculated his position in front of the projector screen perfectly. Mom was sitting right in his line of sight, offering emotional support, while Uncle Robert was off to his side. "Before we say grace," Michael began, his voice steady and full of a practiced, sorrowful pity, "there's something I've kept bottled up for way too long. I stayed quiet to protect Dad's dignity. But today, Dad couldn't handle the strain of the long trip, so he couldn't make it. Yet David sits right there, acting like nothing happened. I think everyone has a right to know why our family was torn apart." He clicked the remote. A blown-up photo of a forged power of attorney appeared on the screen. "First, this is the financial power of attorney from November 17th, 2021. It clearly lists David as a joint authorized user." It looked incredibly official, even down to the indentation of the notary stamp. Then, the screen switched. Second, a screenshot of the internal transfer receipts from First National Bank of Arizona. Look at the dates, November 21st to December 3rd. 3 liquidations and transfers totaling $320,000. The memo explicitly states, "Per instruction of D. Sterling." Third, a written statement from Chloe. She was standing right outside the hospital room and heard firsthand how David used tax threats to terrify Dad, forcing him to sign while he was heavily medicated. He had even put together a beautiful timeline chart. The relatives around the table started whispering. My cousin gave me a look that was a mix of pity and absolute disgust. Michael's eyes welled up, tears glistening right on cue. Dad's life savings and assets were drained dry in less than a month. When Dad confronted him, David didn't just cut off all contact. He was heartless enough to completely ghost us, even when Dad later barely survived an emergency room scare. A look of painful confirmation washed over Mom's face. It was as if she had always known I was that kind of person, and someone was finally saying it out loud. Chloe sat nearby, dabbing the corners of her eyes, playing the part of the heartbroken wife, totally forgetting that a massive chunk of that money from selling the cars and property went straight into the bottomless pit her husband used to fund their lavish lifestyle. I didn't want to believe it was true, he's my brother, but this ironclad evidence... Michael shook his head. My cousin Brad couldn't contain himself. "David, is any of this true? How could you..." My Aunt Eleanor chimed in, shouting, "David, are you mute? Why aren't you defending yourself?" 5 years of pure silence. Michael delivered the final blow, his voice cracking with theatrical perfection. "Because he has absolutely nothing to say, because it's the truth, and he knows it better than anyone." I sat there with my hands on my thighs, gripping the handle of that matte black waterproof case. 5 years of biting my tongue, 140 pages of a devastating counterattack, all packed inside this box. I could have slammed it on the table right then and there. I could have thrown Agent Lance's report, the IP tracking logs, and the blockchain transfer nodes straight in his face. But Dad had told me to wait, so I just sat there. I didn't say a word. I watched Michael bring this ridiculous drama, 5 years in the making, to its absolute peak. The fake evidence he built was flawless. Forged documents, a lying witness, a perfect chain of logic, and tears right on cue. But there was one single thing he didn't count on. The heavy oak front door suddenly let out a dull, heavy click. A gust of freezing wind swirled a few snowflakes into the warm dining room. Everyone turned their heads. There was Arthur Sterling, 71 years old. He was sitting in his custom electric wheelchair, his legs covered by a thick blanket. Pushing the wheelchair was Sarah, the therapist they didn't know. He stopped right at the entrance of the dining room, blocking the light from the hallway. The entire house instantly went dead silent. The fork in my mother's hand dropped onto her porcelain plate, making a sharp, clinking sound. The color drained from Michael's face so fast you could actually see it, and his lips parted slightly. "Michael," Dad said. His voice wasn't loud, but every word carried the weight of iron. "Shut that damn projector off." Uncle Robert bolted upright, his chair scraping loudly against the carpet. Eleanor let out a sharp gasp, sounding like someone was choking her. Michael completely froze, the remote control in his hand looking like a piece of red-hot iron. "Dad," he stammered, his voice floating in the air. Your body can't handle a trip this long. You're supposed to be at the care facility." "My body handles it just fine," Dad said, shifting the joystick on his wheelchair to roll slowly into the center of the room. "Sarah brought me, and Michael, my mind is completely clear. I was kept in a fog for 5 whole years, but right now, I am sharper than I have ever been." He looked around the long table. He looked at my mother, whose face was pale as a ghost, at Uncle Robert standing up straight, and at the 28 other family members who were about to watch me get completely vindicated, or watch him destroy his own beloved eldest son with his own hands. Then he looked at me. For the first time in 5 years, our eyes met with absolutely nothing blocking us. His mask completely shattered. In that split second, a wave of endless regret, deep sorrow, and profound love washed over the old man's face. "David," he said, "come here." I stood up. I walked around the crowded folding tables, past my stunned nieces and nephews, and through relatives who looked like they were staring at a ghost. Chloe was instinctively backing herself into a corner. Michael tried to step out to block me. "Dad, don't let him fool you. He's trying to manipulate you again. Move," Dad said. There was no screaming, just absolute, undeniable authority. Michael stepped aside like he had just been hit by an electric shock. I walked right up to the wheelchair. Dad reached out with a trembling hand and tightly gripped my arm. He smelled like rubbing alcohol, pine needles, and the father I thought I had lost forever. "I'm sorry," he whispered, choking back tears. "I should have believed you." "It's not your fault," I replied softly. "You were too sick back then. There was no way you could have seen through it." "I should have known you wouldn't just hang up on me like that. We'll talk about the details later. Right now, let's settle this score." He let go of my arm and spun his wheelchair around to face the long table. "For 5 years," he told the room, "Michael has been telling me every single day that David stole my retirement fund and threw me away like a piece of garbage. He showed me bank records with David's name on them. He read me fake cold-hearted emails saying we were done. He locked my iPad, filtered my visitors, and rejected every single package David sent. And I believed him. Because he was my eldest son, the one I was so proud of. I never imagined he would lie like this." Eleanor finally found her voice, her tone shaking. "Arthur, what on earth are you talking about?" "I am talking about the fact that 3 weeks ago, Sarah found an old iPad in a cardboard box in the garage. It had synced 112 package tracking alerts from David, and 85 encrypted voicemails. Every single one was asking how I was doing, begging to know what he did wrong. 5 years of his life, and I never had a single clue." He pulled the old iPad out from under his blanket and slammed it down hard on the table closest to him. "Because Michael blocked every single signal." Those words hit everyone in the chest like a sledgehammer. 85 messages. This wasn't abandonment at all. It was a rescue mission that had been systematically cut off. Michael's Adam's apple bobbed up and down frantically. "Dad, those are all fake data he cooked up later, just to make you feel bad. He's a compliance guy. He knows how to hack and forge anything." "Then let's show them what real evidence looks like," Dad said coldly. "Forget your slideshow. Let's look at what David brought." I lifted the heavy Pelican case onto the main table. The thick black box looked incredibly imposing against the white tablecloth. I punched in the combination, and with a sharp click, the latches popped open. "My turn," I said, switching completely into investigator mode. I pulled out the document with the red tab, held it up, and showed the raised notary seal. "This is my official legal declaration declining to act as a financial trustee. It was signed on November 14, 2021, at the Mayo Clinic Patient Services Desk and notarized by Marcus Reed. That is a full 3 days before Michael's alleged power of attorney." I handed it across to Uncle Robert. "Uncle Robert, you spent half your career investigating fraud at the SEC. You verify this seal." Robert took the paper, pulled out his reading glasses to inspect it closely, and then looked up to stare dead at Michael. The raised seal, the security stamp, the date and time are all flawless. This is a fully binding legal declination. I kept going. My firm's compliance department can also prove that I filed this internally right away. I declined because, as an auditor, taking over assets with potential business ties would be a massive conflict of interest. I would have to be insane to risk my professional license like that. My cousin Brad built up the courage to ask, "Then what about the name on the bank transfer records? Just because a name is on it doesn't mean I'm the one who did it." I pulled out the folder with the purple tab and tossed the copy of Michael's fake power of attorney onto the table. This is the forged document Michael submitted to the bank on November 20th. The signature was made using the custom name stamp Mom keeps in the den drawer. Forensic document examiners have already verified the ink pressure distribution patterns. That is absolutely not a handwritten signature. Next, I pulled out the green and blue files. This is the asset tracing report co-authored by an independent auditor and a former FBI agent. Every single withdrawal and liquidation, including the car auctions and the property refinancing, took place inside the state of Arizona. During those exact days, my clock-in records and keycard logs clearly show I was in Boston leading an audit team working overtime. Where did the money go? Every single cent went through at least 3 wire transfers and ended up in an offshore account under the name Siren Capital. That account was used to cover the massive margin calls Michael hit when his crypto accounts blew up. Michael's face was now the color of ash. Chloe snapped and stood up instantly. "You took the money from selling Dad's vintage cars to cover your trading losses? You told me that was bridge funding from a venture capital firm." "Chloe, shut up," Michael snarled. But I wasn't finished. On December 2nd, $100,000 was washed from that offshore account back into your Delaware business account. By December 10th, you bought a vacation condo in Las Vegas with cash. The Tesla you drove here today? The down payment was covered by $20,000 taken from the tail end of those funds. I pulled out high-definition surveillance photos from under the black tab, every single one stamped with a timestamp. This is Michael standing in the auction house finance office. Signing the paperwork, it wasn't me, it was him. The photos were passed around among the relatives. The images were undeniable. The smile on his face and the motion of him signing the check were crystal clear. Aunt Eleanor held one of the photos, her entire body shaking as she looked at Michael. "So it was you? You threw all that dirt on David?" "Dad had a stroke. His brain wasn't working right," Michael suddenly screamed, completely breaking down. "Someone had to liquidate those assets. Were we just supposed to watch them lose value with the market? So you forge federal legal documents to steal your father's life savings?" Uncle Robert's voice was cold as a blade. "Michael, I spent over 20 years tracking financial crimes. What you did isn't called liquidating assets. It's called systemic financial elder abuse. And on top of that, you framed your own brother." I pulled out page 74 of the report. "He blocked my MAC address. He confiscated Dad's iPad, every single certified FedEx package I sent out month after month." I threw the thick stack of delivery receipts signed by Chloe and Michael all over the table. "He immediately destroyed. For 5 long years, he spun this airtight web to make sure I could never get anywhere near the truth. The proof was absolute. The table was completely covered in server logs, asset tracking maps, notarized documents, and surveillance photos." Michael looked around the room, desperately searching for even a shred of support. But there was nothing. Every single person was staring at him like he was a monster. Chloe grabbed her designer bag, not even bothering to pick up her coat. "You are an absolute fraud," she spat out. She bolted straight for the front door, slamming it behind her as she left. She knew that with this evidence out in the open, Michael was completely finished, and she wanted absolutely no part in a federal investigation. My mother, Eleanor, covered her mouth, her tears flowing uncontrollably. "Michael, what on earth have you done?" Backed into a corner, Michael finally snapped. He slammed both hands onto the table, his voice sounding raspy and desperate. "I didn't have a choice. The crypto market crashed, I was 5 times leveraged, and my company was about to face liquidation. We have 2 kids and a mortgage that costs over 10 grand a month. I completely intended to put the money back as soon as the market bounced, but the hole just kept getting deeper and deeper. I was too terrified to tell Dad because he would look down on me. Making David the bad guy was just too easy. He always acts like a cold-blooded machine anyway, so everyone figured this was exactly something he would do. Right there in that room, in front of 28 eyewitnesses, and recorded perfectly by my military-grade audio device, he confessed to the whole thing. 5 years of carefully orchestrated lies completely crumbled in a single evening under the weight of absolute proof. What followed was a suffocating, dead silence. Michael just stood there looking completely ridiculous in his pristine suit. He was still clutching his copy of the indictment papers as if they could somehow save his life. I reached all the way to the bottom of the waterproof case and pulled out the very last document. It was a form inside a manila envelope. "Michael," I said calmly, "this is a fully completed criminal referral form for the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. The charges include wire fraud, interstate money laundering, forgery of legal documents, identity theft, and elder abuse. You used interstate networks to move these assets, which makes this a straight-up federal felony." His eyes went wide with pure terror. "David, please. I am giving you exactly 2 options," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Option 1, you sign an immediate quitclaim deed putting up all the equity in your Scottsdale home to pay back the $320,000 plus 5 years of compounded interest. You sell your Las Vegas condo, and you are strictly banned from seeing Dad without Uncle Robert present. Option 2, I walk out that door right now, and this packet will be sitting on an FBI agent's desk first thing tomorrow morning. Under federal sentencing guidelines, you are looking at 12 years easy. You have 60 seconds. The countdown hung silently in the air. At the 30-second mark, Michael looked at Mom, practically begging for help, but Eleanor closed her eyes and turned her face away. By 45 seconds, the relatives around him were instinctively backing away, like being too close to him might expose them to some kind of toxic poison. 60 seconds. "I'll sign," Michael said weakly, collapsing into his chair and burying his face in his hands. "I'll sign. I'll pay the money back. Just don't call the cops, please." "Uncle Robert will personally oversee the liquidation and the return of the funds," I said coldly. "If a single payment is even 1 day late, I initiate the process immediately. Do you understand me?" "I understand." Dad looked at the man who used to be his proudest eldest son, his eyes filled with nothing but deep exhaustion. "Michael, you don't ever get to mention the word trust to me again for the rest of your life. From now on, you only see me when I say so." There wasn't a hint of pity in Dad's voice. The dinner was completely ruined. Nobody touched a single bite of food. The massive turkey sat in the roasting pan as the grease turned white and cold, and the expensive wine glasses reflected nothing but the ugly truth. Relatives began quietly grabbing their coats, leaving with their families without saying a word. My cousin Brad hugged me tightly before he walked out the door, whispering through his tears, "I'm so sorry, David. We really should have asked more questions back then." Uncle Robert stayed behind. He walked over to Dad and me, patting me on the shoulder. "I'll head over with the lawyer tomorrow morning to handle the paperwork for the property lien. You've carried this heavy load for 5 long years, kid. You handled this better than anyone could have." The cabin cleared out incredibly fast. Michael was left sitting all by himself at the dining table, with his projector still casting a harsh blue light across the room. As I was helping Dad put on his heavy coat to leave, my mother walked over. She looked like she had aged 10 years in a single night. "David," she said, reaching out with a trembling hand, "I am so sorry. I truly believed—" "You chose to believe the story that was easier to accept," I said. I didn't pull away from her touch, but I didn't hold her hand back either. Because in your heart, he was always the golden boy, and I was just the outsider. I can't expect you to change overnight. Some cracks just can't be patched up right now." She nodded, her tears hitting the carpet, and she didn't push any further. I rolled Dad's wheelchair toward the RV waiting outside. The freezing snowflakes hit my face, making me feel sharper and more clear-headed than ever. Sarah already had the engine running, and the heat was blasting inside. "Thank you," I told her, completely from the bottom of my heart. "Thank you for plugging in that charger, and thank you for making this drive." "He talked the whole way about how you used to teach him how to use computers when you were a kid," Sarah said with a warm smile, her eyes welling up. "He loves you so much." I helped lift Dad's wheelchair up into the cabin. Come back to Boston with me, Dad. My place has a huge south-facing bedroom on the first floor with its own accessible bathroom. That's where your home is." "I'd really like that," he said, a tiny spark returning to his faded eyes. That night, I drove right behind the RV, heading east. The black Pelican case sat right there in the passenger seat. I had just won a massive legal battle without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. For 5 years, I had been waiting for the chance to shout the truth out in the open. But when the moment finally came, the knockout blow didn't even come from me. Michael did it to himself. A lie requires absolutely everyone to play along to maintain its fragile structure, and the moment ironclad numbers, logic, and proof are laid out on the table, the whole thing tends to collapse in absolute silence. The 11 months that followed were a lot tougher than I expected, but they were also warmer than I ever could have imagined. Dad moved into my apartment in Beacon Hill just 3 days after Thanksgiving. We completely cleared out a room that used to be packed with old audit files. He didn't bring much with him. Just a few changes of clothes, his pill organizers, and the bag holding that old iPad. For the first week, neither of us mentioned Michael. We just focused on getting used to being around each other again. I made coffee every morning, and he sat by the bay window reading the East Coast papers. At night, we stopped watching the old westerns he used to love and switched to classic Humphrey Bogart film noirs, those old movies that were always about detectives uncovering the truth and justice showing up late. Bit by bit, we pieced together the 5 years we had lost. He talked about how incredibly lonely it was in that luxurious room in Scottsdale, and the unspoken phoniness of every single one of Michael's visits. He described how my face had actually started to blur in his mind, because every single time he asked about me, the response was always, "He's too busy, he doesn't want anything to do with us." I used to sit up at night thinking, he told me one afternoon in March, while we were catching some sun by the Charles River, that even if David really did take the money, if he would just come visit me, I wouldn't care. But I was just so exhausted, and in early 2023 the doctors thought they saw early signs of dementia. My memory was getting worse. Michael completely weaponized that, making me feel like my own instincts were totally broken. Signs of dementia? My fingers tightened around my coffee cup. Another massive piece of the puzzle I knew absolutely nothing about. We started cooking meals together in the kitchen. I actually managed to learn his absolute pride and joy, a real, authentic New England clam chowder. We spent 3 full hours messing around in the kitchen one weekend in May. He stood right over me, teaching me exactly how to crisp up the bacon and perfect the ratio of heavy cream. He insisted on writing the recipe down with a hand that was shaking more and more each day, using a blank index card. He dated it May 20th, 2025. At the very bottom, he wrote, "To David, the one who always stood by the truth." I put that card straight into a frame. It hangs in my kitchen to this day. Michael tried to come visit twice, once in June and once in September. Both times Uncle Robert came along and the meetings happened in a public coffee shop in Boston. Michael had sold his house and wired the money he managed to scrape together into Dad's secure account, and he was still paying a penalty interest rate every month. "I know what I did is completely unforgivable," Michael said during the September visit. He had lost a massive amount of weight and looked completely hollowed out as he pleaded with us. "But I'm seeing a therapist, and I am truly trying to make amends." "That's good, Michael," Dad said, his face completely expressionless. "I hope it works out for you." "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? Ask me again in a year." "If I even have a year left," Michael said with a bitter smile. The reality was, Dad didn't. In October, Dad's health took a massive turn for the worse. The vascular damage from that original stroke was a ticking time bomb, and it finally went off. He spent a week in the hospital, and the doctors told us flat out that surgery wasn't an option anymore. I took an extended leave of absence from work to stay by his side 24 hours a day. We finished watching the rest of the Bogart movies and talked for hours. "David," he said out of nowhere one night, "I was so incredibly proud of how you handled yourself that evening. You had such lethal evidence, and you could have easily called the cops right then, put him in handcuffs, and completely destroyed his entire life. But you gave him a chance to choose to pay it back on his own. That kind of restraint takes a lot more strength than revenge." "That's exactly what you taught me growing up," I said, holding his hand. "You always told me that being right doesn't mean you have to be cruel." Late one night in January, with a massive blizzard blanketing Boston, Dad's breathing became incredibly faint. I knew the time had come, and he knew it too. He refused to be rushed to the emergency room again. The hospice nurse had set up everything to keep him as comfortable as possible right at home. He was surprisingly sharp that afternoon. He brought up Mom, saying she made a terrible mistake, but she paid a heavy price for it. She lost him, she lost her illusion of her eldest son, and she almost lost me. He told me that was already the harshest punishment she could ever face. As for Michael, Dad said he would have to live the rest of his life carrying the weight of what he did, which was heavier than any sentence a courtroom could ever hand down. Later that afternoon, just as the streetlights outside the window started flickering on, he smiled and closed his eyes. He told me not to let those 5 years swallow up the rest of my life, and that I had won back the truth, which was more than enough. I promised him I would. Arthur Sterling passed away peacefully in the early morning hours of January 14, 2026. He left this world without fear, completely free from the web of lies, and knowing exactly who had loved him all along. The funeral was held back home in California. Michael actually showed up, but he hid in the shadows of the very back row of the church, way too terrified to come anywhere near me. Mom held me tight and sobbed, and I just let her hold me, though I knew that kind of deep ice would take a very long time to melt. Uncle Robert gave the eulogy, speaking about integrity, the truth, and the incredible power of refusing to let lies go unchallenged. He never mentioned Michael's name once, because he didn't need to. I chose the inscription for Dad's headstone myself. Arthur Sterling, The Truth Endures. Shortly after the funeral, I was going through Dad's things and found an old photo with frayed edges tucked inside the pocket of his worn-out jacket. It was a picture of the two of us taken back in 2015, on the day I officially got my license. On the back of the photo, written years ago in his strong, sharp handwriting, was a single line: David Sterling, forensic accountant, my most honest son. It turned out that even during those 5 stolen years, through all of Michael's relentless brainwashing, he had kept that photo right against his chest. It was his absolute last line of defense against the lies. Just last week, I took on a brand new case. An 82-year-old woman's niece came to my office with a messy stack of transfer records, telling me that the old woman's son was systematically cutting her off from everyone and had already secretly taken out a mortgage on her house. Looking at those familiar records of rejected letters and blocked phone numbers, it felt exactly like looking at myself 7 years ago. "We are going to make this case absolutely bulletproof," I told the panicked niece. "Track down every single transaction and build a perfect timeline. Just be patient." "Mr. Sterling, is this really going to work? Sometimes lies are just too powerful." I pointed to the framed photo of Dad and me sitting right on my desk. "The truth might get blocked, messed with, or buried deep under an avalanche of lies. But as long as you document everything meticulously, and as long as you refuse to give up," I said, looking her dead in the eye, "the truth will eventually speak for itself. I'm going to help you win it all back." Real justice doesn't need tens of thousands of likes on the internet, and it doesn't need loud, dramatic scenes in public. It only requires unassailable data, unbreakable patience, and a fundamental belief that the person who loved you behind that wall of lies never truly left. 11 months together, clam chowder, old movies, and 85 voicemails that were finally heard. It was way too short, and it will never be enough to make up for the years we lost. But it was entirely real. For an investigator who survives on evidence and logic, that is the most perfect closure I could ever ask for.